Transmogrification of Wamba's Revenge by H.L. Gold. In the first episode, we met our narrator, Wamba, a Western-educated member of a Pygmy tribe, her father, the super chief of all the Pygmies, and her husband, the head witch doctor. We have been introduced to the outsiders in their world, Professor Todd, a scientist researcher on a quest for possible new medicines, Mrs. Todd, and the local white hunter, Mr. Lundeen, safari guide to tourists, who is also a source for many supplies, as well as extreme aggravation for the tribe. Suspicious of Lundeen and Mrs. Todd's apparent affection for each other, Wamba follows them and records their conversation as evidence. Upon discovering that they intend to abscond and leave both the professor without resources and the tribe unpaid, she decides on a course of action. She serves them their daily cocktail, and then waits. Find out what happens to Lundeen and Mrs. Todd and of some unintended consequences in episode 2 of H.L. Gold's The Transmogrification of Wamba's Revenge.
Professor Todd looked very upset when I came into the lab the next morning, toting a bag and my tape recorder. He was wearing a surgical mask for some reason, to avoid contaminating the white rats he was trying to work on, I suppose.
Princess, my wife is gone.
Real gone, I said with a grin. And that's not just her opinion, it's Lundeen's too.
You think?
He started to say, but couldn't continue. I pushed aside the chemistry equipment on his table and upended my bag. 2 miniature figures in little green smocks tumbled out amid the 4 white rats. Todd stared as the figures jumped to their feet and, clinging to each other, looked wildly around them.
That's Lundeen and my wife. What have you done to them?
I can't tell you that, but I want you to listen to something so you will know that what I've done is justified. And I play back the love scene I had recorded the day before.
So that's why she married me. I always wondered.
He bent down to the little figures.
You didn't have to leave me stranded.
He cried out to Mrs. Todd, who clapped her hands over her ears.
I love you enough to give you a divorce.
Taking off his surgical mask, he turned to me.
You know that what you've done is impossible, don't you? Nothing can shrink 5 or 6 foot people to 5 or 6 inches.
I backed away from him. But that's not what's important, I said in alarm. Not only were they planning to leave you stranded, they were going to leave the tribe unpaid. Todd lost his mad glare.
No question of it. They're a matched set of stinkers. But what have you done? How does it work? You've got to tell me all about it.
I can't. It's so potent a taboo that nobody but the chiefs and witch doctors know about it. I myself learned about it only by accident. The tiny people had been making shrill noises. Now Lundeen pushed Mrs. Todd aside and piped.
Todd, listen to me.
What is it?
Todd asked, bending down to hear the squeaky voice.
The secret is in the scotch she gave us yesterday. I can't tell you what suffering we went through last night, shrinking down to the size. Get to that bottle before she does. It's in my hut.
I was out of the lab door and running for Lundeen's hut as fast as I could go. Halfway there, Todd passed me. It was the only time in my life that I ever wished I were not so small, for my strides were 5 to his 1, and I cursed myself for stupidly not throwing the bottle into a fire. When he reached the hut, I stopped and went back to the lab. The tiny couple in tiny voices pleaded for an antidote as I climbed onto a stool and waiting for Todd to come back, which he did a few minutes later, the bottle in his hand and a hard look on his face. There was silence as he measured out the scotch in eyedroppers and fed different amounts of it to the 4 white rats. I turned away. Until last night, I had never seen anyone or anything shrink. It was a hideous thing I had hoped never to see again.
All right, Princess, you can look now.
Professor said in a sick voice. I turned. The rats were 4 different sizes, the littlest being very little indeed. Professor Todd was cleaning up the last evidence of the shrinking process, as I clean up after Lundeen and Mrs. Todd, in such a fright over leaving traces that I have overlooked the scotch.
Is this how pygmies get small?
No, I said shakily. We breathe through and are immune to what I put in the bottle.
Then what is it for?
Babies of mixed parentage, pygmy and outsider, and that is all I know about it.
Not even the dosages?
Not even that. He filled the eyedroppers again and fed the mixture to the rats while I looked away. When the feeding and shrinking had stopped, he said,
It stabilizes at 1/10 normal size. And you pygmies are immune to it, which means that's not possible.
Why not? I said, falling back until he grabbed my shoulders. I forget which man it was, Peking man or Java man or something.
But he was only 9 feet tall.
What if he wasn't Peking man at all, but Peking baby? He dropped his hands and sat down heavily.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
He looked at me.
Princess, I've got to have a decent amount of whatever it is to work on.
No.
If you don't get it for me, I'll invite your husband and father in to see what you've done to these 2.
Don't, please. I'll get you some, but you got to help me with an alibi so I don't get suspicious.
It's a deal.
What about us? You can't leave us like this.
Todd grinned with a wicked grin.
Would you care to bet on that?
I'll do anything you say. I'll give you all my money. Anything.
Don't bother. I intend to have incontestable proof of your deaths, so I get your money anyhow, without you to spoil it.
He put them, kicking and trying to bite, into a cage and covered it. As an afterthought, he filled the feeder of the cage with a slice of bread and some cold cuts and water.
Have fun, kiddies.
He said merrily, and we went out, and he carefully locked the door. While the professor stood guard, I pulled out a very old, very sturdy trunk from under my husband's bunk, opened it, and scraped off as much moss as I dared from the 5 boulders in it, into a test tube Professor Todd had given me. I closed the trunk and pushed it back under the bunk.
Good.
He said as I handed him the stoppered tube.
Now, to furnish us with an alibi, do you know any good places to lose a Land Rover?
There is a dandy quicksand pit not far away, I said, catching some of his excitement. We got into a Land Rover and I guided him to the spot. Pushing from the rear, we shoved the vehicle into the pit. When it vanished, we brushed away our footprints and went back to the lab. I told him along the way what little I knew of the moss, that it was native only to this part of the world, that it had been totally destroyed by our ancestors, except on the 5 stones after the Pygmy elephant problem, that there was no antidote, and that not the moss, but selective breeding accounted for the size I was so proud of being. That evening, we asked people if they had seen Lundeen and Mrs. Todd, who had never been this late before. As the hours passed, everyone got a little edgy, watching the gate of the compound. At last, the professor looked at his watch and said,
No sense staying up. They must have driven further than they realized and made camp.
So we went to bed. Around noon the next day, Todd let himself be worked up over their disappearance and consented to lead one of their search parties. My husband, the head witch doctor, and my father, the super chief, led the other 2. Naturally, I went with my husband, partly because that's a #1 wife's place, but mostly because I wanted him to make the discovery himself, which he did with only 5 or 6 little nudges from me. The drummer sent out the message, and soon the other 2 parties joined ours.
A great pity.
Where is it?
Said my father with real feeling, looking down sadly at the quicksand pit.
Now, how will we get another white hunter to bring safaris to us?
Always the practical man.
Said my husband admiringly.
Yes, this could be the end of tribal civilization as we know it, anyway.
Todd asked me what the unseemly grief was about, and I told him, doing his best to look bereaved. He held up his hands for silence.
My friends, and in the short time I have known you, you have become friends in need and in deed. I came here in search of a new wonder drug, and I think perhaps I have found it. In return for the testimony of your leaders, so I can inherit my late wife's money, I shall finance the construction of a vast compound and enough huts to house all your tribes at one time.
There was a great cheer led by the head witch doctor and the super chief.
Not only that, there must be room in the compound for 100 guest huts, a tremendous meeting hut, and a large cooking and eating hut, plus classroom huts and an airfield. All this must be accomplished within less than 1 month. Damn the expense, full speed ahead.
The crowd cheered again and headed homeward, talking and gesticulating animatedly among themselves.
It is very nice to become prosperous, but what does he want to spend all this money for?
You are with him all day, every day. It would be discourteous to ask outright. But has he given you no idea?
Not at all, I confess. It was true. Whatever Professor Todd had dreamed of, he hadn't discussed or ever hinted at it until now, nor could I understand it any more than they did. I promised to do everything possible, short of asking, to find out what he had in mind. Early the next morning, we drove to Mdubuti in the mobile laboratory. The professor, the head witch doctor, and the super chief in the front seat, and me in the lab, which was kept locked at all times. Mrs. Todd and Lundeen hung onto the bars of their cage as the lab bounced and lurched in and out of the ruts of the jungle road. They alternately tried to bribe and threaten me. I looked at them without listening, doing my best to figure out what Todd meant to do. I hadn't succeeded when we reached town, nor when we each deposed as to the fates of the unlucky pair, nor when the professor withdrew a very large amount of money and gave part of it to my father and husband to buy whatever supplies were needed, as well as a used truck and jeep that he presented to the tribe. While the men were shopping, he and I went to the cable office, where he sent off a number of telegrams to Dr. This and Professor That in various countries, on both sides of the iron and bamboo curtains. I had no trouble getting to see what he had composed as he went through a little black book for the addresses. He couldn't have been less secretive about his invitation to spend your vacation in glamorous and spoil and booty. Live for 2 madcap weeks amid the unchanging pygmies of still dark Africa, and so forth. He smiled down at me as I frowned over the inscrutable telegram.
Puzzle you? It shouldn't. This is why I want all the tribes together in the huge compound and huts to house them, because we are going to have company from all over the world. Not a great many by resort standards, but enough to make room for in the jungle.
I couldn't ask, of course, but I could and did look worried.
Are you thinking that I'll betray your secret, princess?
I nodded.
I give you my word that I shall not be the one to do so.
I brightened visibly, and when the other 2 men joined us, I told them about the cable grants.
To study us, no doubt.
A symposium, perhaps.
Whatever it is, it will be in practically the only place on Earth that isn't preparing for war. Anyhow, we will know very soon. The cables gave March 22nd as the opening date.
When is that?
I asked at the cable office 3 weeks from now.
Then we must really hurry.
And hurry we did, as each tribe reported in and went to work on its portion of the new compound and the various huts. I, meanwhile, assisted Todd in the lab, but without understanding what he was calling this meeting for. Would it be the strange moss? Then why had he carelessly emptied the test tube of it into an enamel tray kind of thing and shoved it under the lab's night light and seemed to have forgotten it? Instead, he was taking blood samples from many of us, and even with great difficulty, a tiny amount from Lundeen and Mrs. Todd. This he made plates of, and to my unskilled eyes, they looked like any other blood specimens, which goes to show how much bio I had absorbed at Bennington.
Thank you. This completes our 2nd episode of the Transmogrification of Wamba's Revenge by H.L. Gold. And now we're going to hear Bernie sing Windmills of Your Mind.
Thank you, Margaret. And Windmills of Your Mind